I'm James Rizone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 26. Recon the Route. 6th August 1990. 11th Motorized Brigade. King Khalid Military City, Saudi Arabia. First Lieutenant Muhammed al-Tikriti got to spend one night in King Khalid Military City before having to mount up and move out at 0 to 400 hours. His scout platoon for the 1st Battalion of the 11th Motorized Brigade had enough time to refuel their vehicles and take on some rations before the battalion commander contacted him. The battalion commander walked up to al-Tikriti, getting his attention. "Lieutenant, we've been ordered to resume the attack in the morning. You're going to be leading the brigade and moving as fast as possible to clear a path and identify any possible targets of opportunity. Your unit is to move along the highway from here to Al Jamajm. It's imperative that you not get bogged down along the way. Your units need to stay on the move with speed and report any impediments to our movement. While your unit is on the move, the division wants to know if you come across any gas stations along the way, as well as the location and disposition of any Saudi forces of any kind, any topographic adjustments we should make to our maps, or changes in soil composition. Once you reach Al Jamajm, report the condition of the population. Are they passive, or are they going to resist? If you can drive through the town, do so, but do not become engaged. If you must, bypass the town and proceed southwest to Al-Artawiya. Again, determine the attitude of the populace. It is only 25 miles south of Al Jamajm, so you should be there by 800 hours. Once you've reached your objective, you need to halt in an overwatch position of the road from Riyadh and the road to Medina. The battalion will be about an hour behind you. Any questions?" his battalion commander asked. Lieutenant al-Tikriti shook his head in the negative. "No, sir. I understand my orders." He'd been serving in this position for over 2 years with his commander, so he understood the man's intent pretty well by this point, as well as his own job. "Good. After sunrise, if you need close air support, the division's helicopters will be at your disposal. Call for them, and they will be able to come to you quickly. They're being kept on standby at base roughly 100 kilometers from our position. If you locate any sort of airfield of any kind between Al Jamajm and Al-Artawiya, check it out and report if there is any aviation fuel there or any kind of support facilities. Maybe we'll get lucky and find a new forward base we can get the helicopters positioned out of. I like the idea of having them much closer to the front than where they currently are. Oh, and, Lieutenant, later in the day, I will know if we're being directed to proceed towards either Medina or Riyadh. Stay ready to move in either direction." Lieutenant al-Tikriti smiled. "I hope it's to Medina. Then we'll be the ones to liberate the holy city of Mecca." "Lieutenant, let's get to Medina first, and then we can think about going on to Mecca," the battalion commander responded with a smile. He liked the lieutenant's enthusiasm. He just hoped it didn't get him killed. At 0400, the scout platoon rolled out of the gates of King Khalid Military City. The corps commander's flag flew over the central administrative building, while infantry soldiers who appeared to be acting as security manned some of the street corners. Saudi soldiers and their families were instructed to remain indoors until further notice, and no harm would come to them. Most of the soldiers of the 2nd Republican Guard Corps had not entered the city complex as General Ra'ad al-Hamdani did not want any conflict between the forces. He wanted to win over the Saudi forces and convince them to join with the Iraqi forces in deposing the king. He was particularly optimistic about getting the Saudis to provide them some insight into the new Saudi M1A1 Abrams tanks they had purchased from the Americans. The rumor mill said they were far superior to the Iraqi T-72s and much more technologically sophisticated. Lieutenant al-Tikriti wasn't stupid. He knew General al-Hamdani would want his own soldiers to learn how to use this captured equipment as quickly as they could. Interestingly enough, al-Tikriti heard they had captured several American contractors when they'd captured the military city. Apparently, they were part of a larger group of trainers instructing the Saudi army on how to use and maintain the new tanks. As of yet, these American contractors would not teach the Iraqis how to use them. Al-Tikriti figured they'd eventually come around, or they'd be made to come around at some point. As the scout platoon proceeded southwest on the 4-lane road, they met little traffic. This was a deserted portion of desert for 72 kilometers, with only an occasional home for a shepherd or a truck stop with fuel every 20 miles or so. The desert was lacking sand dunes but had plenty of hard-packed sand and rock outcroppings dotting the landscape. Terrain features his men were annotating and making sure the follow-on units were aware of. At each of the truck stops, they would purchase some sodas and snacks. They wanted to demonstrate to the locals that they were not conquerors, but liberators. They also secretly, or in some cases, not so secretly, disconnected the telephone lines to make sure the locals couldn't phone ahead and report their positions. As the sun rose in the eastern sky, foretelling a clear day, al-Tikriti had his unit disperse and pause for Fajr, the morning prayer. They were 48 kilometers southwest of King Khalid Military City, overlooking a truck stop with a mosque. In the distance, the call to prayer could be heard. Lieutenant al-Tikriti did not want to enter the mosque with his soldiers and their weapons, so they stayed 400 meters to the northwest and faced Mecca. When Fajr was finished, they remounted their vehicles and continued on. The desert area they were scouting was open, with little vegetation. While it was desolate, it was not always flat. The terrain rolled almost like the sea, with many deep cuts or wadis caused by rapid flooding in the very short, rainy season that generally lasted just 2 days a year. When the rains did come, the ground did not easily absorb the water as it was baked hard from the sun. The result was the formation of rapid runoffs. The resulting wadis could be an impediment to vehicles attempting to cross them perpendicularly, or an asset in concealing the movement of vehicles running in the bottom of them, depending on their width and depth. This was why their scout unit was out here. They needed to identify the potential hazards and opportunities the land presented in case they needed to use them. Since concealment was not a concern right now, Lieutenant al-Tikriti kept his vehicles on the highway. He wanted to move rapidly and cover as much ground as possible while still fulfilling their mission. At an average speed of 30 kilometers an hour, his calculations said he should reach Al Jamajm in roughly an hour. Moving south, Lieutenant al-Tikriti became concerned as the terrain changed from the hard-packed ground and rock outcroppings to the soft sand and small dunes typical of most deserts. This kind of terrain, however, was not as easy for a large force to travel or fight on if it came to that. The fine sand tended to get into everything, to include the gears of tracks, the air filters for the engines, and other areas that caused problems for vehicles. Continuing down the highway, al-Tikriti noted on his map where the terrain changed and how the follow-on vehicles would need to traverse it. The tracked vehicles wouldn't have a problem moving on the soft sand, but the wheeled vehicles would. This meant the ash and trash vehicles, or supply trucks, would need to stay on the highway while the tracked vehicles could fan out across the sand. Once he'd finished making his notes, he handed them off to his sergeant, who'd transmit the findings back to the battalion operations officer to distribute to the company commanders. Continuing down the highway while his sergeant radioed in his notes, al-Tikriti just shook his head. Why the hell wasn't this done long before now? These Russian maps are almost totally out of date. I wish we didn't have to rely so much on their help. The British and American maps are far superior. Why are we not using them? His thoughts were interrupted by the abrupt stop of his vehicle. "What is wrong?" he asked his driver as he looked up, a bit startled. The driver did not need to answer. They had just come around a slight curve in the road when they spotted it, roughly 500 meters to their front, a customs station. The first sign of possible danger they'd seen since the assault on the Saudi military base a few days ago. Pulling his binoculars out, al-Tikriti scanned the area. The customs station had a building on the side of the road and several covered lanes on both sides of the highway to allow the inspectors to carry out their duties in the shade. This was typical of what you'd see along some of the roads not too far from the border. The station had 4 V-100 armored cars, positioned in such a manner that they blocked the highway altogether. The terrain off to each side was open and flat for about 300 meters on either side. But then the rolling sand dunes he had been traveling through for the past hour resumed. "I don't think they spotted us, Lieutenant. What do you want us to do?" asked his senior sergeant. "I'm thinking," was his immediate reply. "What are my options here? I could proceed and see if they will surrender to me. I could proceed and engage them, which may give them time to send out a warning and call for reinforcements. I do have some AT-3 Sagger anti-tank missiles I could use from a distance. We could also call for a helicopter gunship to dispose of them, but if we do that, it'll take time for them to spin up and get here, which means I'll lose several hours. No, I have to do this myself." After considering his options, he made his decision. "Sergeant," al-Tikriti called as he dismounted the vehicle. "Sir? Dismount the men. Get 6 of the AT-3 weapons and 6 teams to come with me. I intend to get off to the side of the highway and move down the shoulders to get us in range of the Saggers. If they are not paying attention, we may be able to get fairly close before we use them. I want you and the rest of the men to stay here with the vehicles while I take the teams forward. When you hear the shooting and explosions, come racing down the highway towards them. Use the guns and engage whatever is left. Any questions?" The sergeant grinned. "No, sir. I like this idea. I'll get the teams organized and ready to go. Do you want to radio in what we discovered and what we're going to do?" "I will. Now get the men ready and let's do this thing." The sergeant turned and started issuing orders to the excited soldiers. They hadn't fired their own weapons yet, so the opportunity to engage in their own part of the war was exhilarating. When the soldiers were ready, Lieutenant al-Tikriti briefed the soldiers. 3 teams would proceed down one side of the highway as the other 3 teams moved with the lieutenant. As they moved, they'd look to utilize concealment behind the dunes as much as possible until they got in position. Once they knew the plan, the 6 teams moved out. It took them half an hour to get in position. They'd managed to move within 400 meters of the checkpoint when al-Tikriti motioned for his teams to start setting up their Saggers. It was time for their recon team to finally get in the fight. Once the 6 teams had crawled to the top of their respective dunes, they started assembling the AT-3s. These were anti-tank missiles that would fly flat and true, right to their intended targets. Since they were wire-guided missiles, it was important to have a clear line of sight so the gunner could fly the missile to the target. Lieutenant al-Tikriti had once had the opportunity to see the American Tau anti-tank system with its optically guided missile, and he wished they had that weapon instead of the Sagger. It was much more accurate than their own. Still, he was confident in his men's ability and their training. Since there were only 4 armored cars at the checkpoint, they'd only fire 4 of the 6 missiles they had with them. This way, if one didn't work or somehow missed, they'd still have 2 more ready to go. "We're ready, sir," one of his sergeants announced. Lieutenant al-Tikriti nodded, giving them the go-ahead. 4 loud pops and swooshing noises could be heard as the missiles leapt from their tubes and flew across the 400 meters at lightning speed. There was almost no time to see the missiles as they flew across the space between them before all 4 of them impacted against the V-100 armored cars. The 4 vehicles exploded in spectacular fashion as the warhead slammed into them. Several customs agents and soldiers standing nearby were thrown to the ground, while a few others had limbs ripped from their bodies or were engulfed in flames. It was a horrific sight. With the sound of the explosion, the reconnaissance platoon's BMPs and BTRs raced down the road towards the smoldering ruins. A couple of soldiers were manning the crew-served weapons and opened up on the stunned Saudi National Guard soldiers and customs agents. While the vehicles were charging towards the station, Lieutenant al-Tikriti and his 6 missile teams left the launchers where they were and took off to join the fight. A couple of soldiers tried to fight back, firing their weapons at the Iraqi soldiers running at them. One National Guard soldier positioned on the roof of the customs building fired his PKM machine gun at the lead BMP. His bullets just ricocheted off the armor and zipped off skyward. The turret operator fired a short burst from the 30mm gun, ripping the Saudi soldier and the customs building to shreds. While this was taking place, at least 2 Saudi soldiers managed to jump into one of the customs vehicles and drove off as fast as the vehicle would go. A few of the BMPs and BTRs tried to engage them with their weapons, but the vehicle had managed to get around a slight bend in the road before their bullets could rip the truck apart. Lieutenant al-Tikriti was mad that some soldiers had managed to escape. Still, they had done a good job of neutralizing the threat and clearing the way for the rest of the battalion, which was only a few hours behind them. Sergeant, use the BTRs and get these vehicles pushed off the road. Do your best to line them up along that side of the road. Then get the rest of the debris moved out of the way. I want these lanes cleared immediately. We need to be back on the road in 20 minutes, understood? Yes, sir, came the swift reply. The men were in good spirits. They'd gotten to blow something up and shoot their rifles and lived to tell about it. What more could they ask for? While the 2 BTRs pushed the blown-out vehicles to the side of the road, a squad of soldiers moved the dead as well. They didn't want to leave their bodies strewn about the road. Once they'd cleared the area up, the convoy resumed its patrol. They'd reported the firefight to the battalion commander, who'd informed them he was only an hour behind. Driving down the highway, they eventually caught sight of Al Jamajm. It appeared to be a town of 1,000 people, with most of them living on the western side of the highway. There was a tall communications tower on either side of the highway as well. From their vantage point on the side of the road, al-Tikriti and his senior sergeant scanned the town and the highway with their binoculars. There was virtually no traffic to be found anywhere. A few people moved about on some of the streets and in front of a few stores, but that was about it. It could just be too early for a lot of activity, but still, al-Tikriti wasn't sure if the town had been warned of their pending arrival. Some of the shops that he would expect to be open were still closed. Then he spotted a man leading a couple of camels in the direction of his scout element. As they got closer, they didn't seem to notice or care that there were 4 armored vehicles sitting on the side of the road, observing them. The man leading the camels nodded as he passed the soldiers. Lieutenant al-Tikriti ordered his patrol to spread their vehicles out a bit, with the soldiers standing up through the top hatches in case of an ambush. They were going to move through the town with caution and report back what they found. He had to keep reminding himself his job was to report, not become decisively engaged or try to seize an objective. Once they'd cleared the town with no outward signs of danger, the patrol picked up speed and continued to Al-Artawiya. Proceeding southwest towards their next objective, the terrain became hard-packed sand and rock outcroppings again. They were also starting to go up in elevation. With the hard-packed sand, al-Tikriti had his vehicles spread out off the highway to acquire a better understanding of the terrain and the maneuverability of the vehicles over the ground. Eventually, they came to a road intersection that branched off to the west and into the foothills, with an increased elevation. 2 hamlets were at the end of this road, and neither looked to be significant. At this point, al-Tikriti reported the intersection and pushed on. 2 miles further south, another hamlet appeared. The people in this little village appeared to ignore them and carry on with their normal business as the armored vehicles rolled on through. The small children of the little village were the only ones to pay the Iraqis any attention. Most just stood and watched, some waved. As they proceeded south, the terrain became rockier and less sandy. Numerous wadis cut through the terrain, posing a potential cross-country mobility problem if they needed to get off the highway. Lieutenant al-Tikriti knew he was close to Al-Artawiya when he came across the airfield to the north of the town. He stopped and dispersed his patrol while 2 vehicles were sent to inspect the airfield and determine if it could be used to refuel aircraft and helicopters. In short order, his team had determined the airfield was usable. Not only was it in decent shape, but it also had a 5,000-liter fuel tank that appeared to be nearly full with aviation fuel. Lieutenant al-Tikriti pulled his vehicles to the east side of the road, which positioned them on the high terrain, with vegetation overlooking the town near the airfield. The town center was 6,000 meters away, and very built up with 1- and 2-story concrete block buildings, typical of the Middle East. The terrain to the east of the town was open, hard-packed sand. To the west was rocky, broken terrain similar to what he was sitting on. To the west was the objective of the division and corps. Lieutenant al-Tikriti was reluctant to move into the town because it was large, and he could only observe a small portion in front. His follow-on mission after reconning the airfield was to proceed towards the corps' objective. To do that, he had to get to the southern side of Al-Artawiya. Instead of taking the direct route through the town, he elected to skirt the eastern side of the town across the open desert. This would give him plenty of room to maneuver and engage any hostiles should they encounter them. Al Majma' was only 40 miles to the south. The 5th Baghdad Motorized Division was to move to Al Majma' and then swing west towards the southern side of Buraida. The 7th Adnan Division would pass to the north of Al-Artawiya and attack to the north side of Buraida. Scout elements for the 5th would clear their route from Al-Artawiya to Buraida. By skirting the eastern side of the town in the open desert, al-Tikriti figured his scout element could travel around most of the town before he had to get on the highway again to cross a major wadi and some very rugged terrain. In a way, it was good he was discovering these features and navigational challenges now. His people were able to annotate them rather than have a company of tanks encounter them later. When he called in to his battalion commander, he relayed what he'd encountered up to this point. His colonel seemed satisfied. The closer his vehicles came to the choke point, which in this case was a deep-cutting wadi, the happier he was to be getting back on the highway. The terrain was becoming a lot harder for their vehicles to traverse. There was one thing that really troubled him. It was nearing midday, and they had hardly seen any traffic. Given the size of this town, they should have seen some by now. The hairs on the back of his neck tingled as if somehow telling him something was wrong, and he needed to stay on his toes. As they proceeded down the highway, the road began to descend towards what appeared to be a valley. The division's primary objective and his secondary objective to recon lay right in the middle of this valley, the city of Al Majma'. The major intersection that led to the west was 6,000 meters in front of him, with scattered homes and pygmy palms scattered throughout the area. He ordered his patrol to leave the road and disperse to the west side of it. The hairs on his neck were speaking to him, and their message was one of caution. Their vehicles started to pass the first grove of palm trees, when suddenly a handful of birds in the trees, 100 meters in front of them, took to the air, like something had scared them. Their sudden movement was followed almost immediately by a small object that flew out of some bushes and slammed into the lead BMP. In seconds, the BMP exploded in flame and smoke as the shaped charge in the RPG ignited some of the ammunition inside the infantry fighting vehicle. The air around them suddenly filled with the sound of buzzing from bullets and swooshes from RPGs being hurled at them. Despite his cautiousness, they had somehow stumbled into a cleverly laid ambush. His turret gunner opened fire on something in front of them. The driver had stopped the vehicle and was rapidly reversing it out of the kill box, also firing off the vehicle's smoke canisters, trying to build up an emergency smoke screen in hopes that they might live long enough to escape. Lieutenant al-Tikriti turned the crew-served weapon in front of him on a set of bushes he'd seen an RPG team firing from. He pulled the trigger hard and sent a stream of bullets into the position, shredding tree branches and debris around it. Another explosion occurred somewhere behind him. He could feel the heat wave wash over him, and as he turned around to see what had happened, the BTR his platoon sergeant had been riding in erupted in flame and black smoke. He instinctively ducked just before a string of bullets pounded the armor around the commander's turret he had just been sitting in. Then al-Tikriti saw a V-100 armored car firing on his vehicle. His turret gunner sent a burst of 30mm rounds into the vehicle, causing it to explode. Moments later, the ground around them started to explode. Rocks, parts of trees, and dirt and sand erupted from the ground like geysers as the sound of 155mm artillery shells began to rain down all around them. The sound of artillery and pieces of metal slapping the sides of his vehicle was the last thing Lieutenant al-Tikriti heard before his world went black and suddenly became very quiet. Chapter 27. Boots on the Ground. 7 August 1990. Marine Expeditionary Unit. USS Tarawa, Red Sea. Miles away, 3 members of the Marine Expeditionary Unit stood on the hangar deck of the USS Tarawa, gazing out towards the port of Jeddah, 75 miles over the horizon. The group consisted of an infantry battalion, an aviation element of helicopters, and a support element as well as a headquarters element, not exactly a large group. The MEU had previously been referred to as an MAU, Marine Amphibious Unit, but a name change had been introduced the previous year. Since the creation of the Corps in 1776 at the Tun Tavern in Philadelphia, Marines had been aboard Navy ships, fighting alongside sailors in defense of the nation. They had a proud tradition of service both aboard ship and ashore. In 1805, First Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon had gone ashore with a Marine detachment and crossed over 600 miles of the Libyan desert to capture the fort at Derna from the pirates of Tripoli. The Eisenhower had sailed from the eastern Mediterranean Sea through the Suez Canal and arrived in the Red Sea. Earlier, the platoon leader had told them to get ready to go ashore. The platoon would be flying to the airport in 2 helicopters that were already on the deck. As this was just a basic rifle platoon, the young Marines were full of apprehension as to what it would be like in Saudi Arabia and what they were going to be doing. "Jeff, you've been ashore here. What's it like?" asked Lance Corporal James Jones, or JJ for short, as he looked over his gear one last time. "Nah, I've been ashore in Israel and Lebanon, but not Saudi Arabia. I understand they're a bunch of tight asses when it comes to drinking and religion. Shit, they don't drink inside their own country but become raving alcoholics outside it. A bunch of hypocrites if you ask me," Corporal Jeff Holland said. Holland had been a Marine for 4 years and loved it. Loved it so much he'd just signed his paperwork to re-enlist for 4 more. He would probably make it a career and didn't mind the sea duty. He wasn't married and had no desire to get married, so sea duty was totally worth it, especially with the extra pay. Lance Corporal Dave Kinnaird, one of the younger Marines in the detachment, asked, "Any idea of how far we are from those Iraqi forces the lieutenant was talking about this morning in the briefing?" Corporal Holland shrugged. "As long as they aren't sitting at that airport, I could care less. Once we get to the airport and set up, they can come in if they want. They'll learn not to mess with us devil dogs." "Oorah! Talk is cheap until the bullets start flying, Corporal," JJ chided. JJ had dropped out of college after his first year. His mother had had a shit fit when he'd joined, but his dad had supported the idea after JJ had promised that when his 4 years were up, he would go back to college. "Do you think anyone else will be coming in here besides us?" Kinnaird asked. "Who knows? We're the first. so I suspect some others will follow behind us. We just have to wait and see. Here comes the platoon sergeant. Guess it's time to load up, JJ announced as he picked up his rucksack and M16 assault rifle along with everyone else. All right, ladies, get in formation, announced their platoon sergeant. As the Marines snapped into a platoon formation of 4 squads, the platoon sergeant started to speak. When we get on the flight deck, 1st and 2nd squad, take the 1st chopper with the captain. 3rd and 4th squad, follow me to the 2nd plane. You know the drill. 2 lines, Gunny Davis said, and turned to start up the ladder, well to the flight deck. The deck of the USS Tarawa was probably the most tightly controlled, orchestrated chaos on any ship. The 6 helicopters were on deck, their engines running, waiting to load up their human cargo. Earlier, several F-14 Tomcats had departed the Eisenhower and were above the ship, providing a protective air cap. Once the Marines were seated, the rotor blades were engaged as the pilots got them ready to depart the floating airbase. Some of the Marines were all smiles. Their smiles quickly vanished as their helicopters lifted off over the blue sea. Once the aircraft was in the air, the pilots turned the choppers toward land as they flew under the cover of a pair of F-14 Tomcats. The flight was no more than 30 minutes from the ship to the airport, and so far, no Iraqi forces had been spotted in the area. The Marines had been given one mission: secure the airport and be prepared to provide security to the arriving Air Force and Army elements until relieved. The Army elements were to secure the port and the airfield if necessary. It was hoped that Saudi police would take care of securing the port. Just securing the airport was going to stretch the Marines to the fullest. The perimeter of the airport was 6 miles long and 5 miles wide, so there was no way they were going to secure the entire place. As a result, the decision had been made that the Marines would instead look to secure just the main terminal complex on the south side. As Army elements began arriving, one company would secure the Aramco terminal on the west side, north of the main terminal, and another would secure the North Gate and Deportees Lounge. Once the choppers arrived, they landed by the control tower and main terminal building for the airport. In short order, the grunts exited the plane and started unloading their equipment. They hadn't brought a lot with them, but what they had brought would allow them to dish out some serious hurt on an enemy. One squad of Marines took off to secure the control tower. They wanted to get a guard detail set up around the entrance, and then a few observers up in the tower itself. This would provide them with a solid overwatch of the entire airport and the surrounding area. Another element took off to secure a group of hangars just south of the main building that connected in front of a large taxi strip. This area had been identified as an initial unloading and staging area. When the Air Force eventually landed and started to bring in some heavier equipment, this was where they'd drop it off. Other companies of the MEU would head into the actual terminal. The terminal was a large facility, and to the surprise of the Marines who'd just arrived, it was nearly packed. There were only 3 large commercial planes docked to the air ramps connecting the station. People were trying to flee the country ahead of the Iraqi army. "Salam alaikum," the Saudi colonel said as he approached the Marines. "Alaikum al-salam," replied Colonel Lightfoot, commander of the MEU, to the astonishment of the Saudi colonel. Colonel Lightfoot was a short, stocky, square-jawed man, almost from the same mold as Chesty Puller. His Marines thought he was harder than a woodpecker's lips to work for, and he was. "I have a lieutenant waiting to guide your men up to the control tower and help you secure the main hangars just as requested. If you'll come with me, I'll walk you into the main terminal. As you can see, it's a bit chaotic here right now," the colonel said as he waved his hand about. "I wasn't aware people were still trying to use the airport to evacuate. Is there anything we can do to help?" asked Colonel Lightfoot. The colonel shook his head. "No. Once these last 3 planes take off, my men will begin dispersing them out of the airport. Then we can start to get things prepared for the rest of your people to arrive. By the way, my name is Colonel Abdulaziz. I've been assigned by the Ministry of Defense to be the liaison officer to the American units arriving. If you or your men need anything, please do not hesitate to ask." The two of them walked briskly towards the terminal, with 2 squads of Marines following behind them. "Thank you, Colonel Abdulaziz. My name is Colonel Lightfoot, commander of the MEU." "Colonel, do you any heavy tanks with you?" Colonel Abdulaziz asked. "No, but we will be having our amphibious assault vehicles and light armored vehicles coming ashore shortly. As you can see, we do have some attack helicopters that have an anti-tank capability, and some Harrier jets at our disposal." "I am beginning to feel better already, Colonel," Abdulaziz said. "Okay, I'd like to have at least 2 of them block the entrance to the airport once they arrive. We want to start locking down who can come into the airport." Abdulaziz smiled and nodded in agreement. "That is a good call. Your men up in the control tower should be able to direct the QRF team if they spot trouble. Last I was told you have more soldiers arriving in a few hours, yes?" Colonel Lightfoot didn't say anything right away. They had just entered the terminal, and it was abuzz with activity. When the rest of the Marines loaded down with their combat gear filtered into the terminal, it suddenly got very quiet as all eyes turned to look at them. The people looked startled and a little concerned by the sudden appearance of Western soldiers. Not many people knew or were aware that the king had formally requested military assistance from the West, and, in particular, the Americans. The sudden appearance of U.S. Marines had certainly caught many of them off guard. Nearly an hour went by before the 3 commercial aircraft had finally departed the airport. With them gone, true to his word, the Saudi colonel, who had a small contingent of soldiers with him, had emptied the terminal. He had also acquired 6 V-150S armored cars for his forces to use. Once they had their QRF established and a roadblock at the entrance to the airport, Colonel Lightfoot felt like they were ready to hunker down while they waited for the cavalry to arrive. A naval officer and an enlisted man had traveled with them. They had set up in the control tower to shepherd in the C-5s en route to the airport. The enlisted man radioed Colonel Lightfoot, letting him know the Air Force planes were preparing to land. Lightfoot made sure his Marines knew the Army had arrived, and to be prepared in case the Iraqis decided to do something froggy. Colonel Abdulaziz was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows with his hands on his hips, watching the first aircraft land. The colonel tilted his head to the side slightly as he spoke. "It amazes me that an aircraft that large can fly." Grinning at the comment, Colonel Lightfoot replied, "You should see how many soldiers will disembark from that thing and what other equipment it's carrying. These things are beasts." His curiosity getting the better of him, he asked, "Colonel Abdulaziz, did you study in England by chance?" Snickering, the colonel replied, "You're curious about my British accent. Yes, I did study in the UK. My father was a diplomat, so we lived in London for 10 years. Did you study Arabic? You seem to have a decent understanding of the language." "I did while I was in college, but that was many years ago." Colonel Lightfoot reached for his radio and told the Navy guys in the control tower to tell the first C-5 to park closer to the terminal than the hangars. "Come, let's go welcome our relief," Lightfoot offered. By the time they had both gotten to the flight line, the aircraft had stopped not far from the terminal. A Marine captain made sure the pilot was able to see him and a few of his Marines with him, so they'd know it was safe. The aircraft wound down its large engines as they began to open its clamshell nose to reveal its cargo. As the rear ramp lowered and the nose rose on the C-5 Galaxy aircraft, Lightfoot and Colonel Abdulaziz were surprised at what they saw. Instead of hardened combat paratroopers, Air Force personnel, led by a female major, deplaned. She immediately spotted Colonel Lightfoot and approached him. She also noted the Saudi colonel and rendered the proper salute. "I'm Major Dickerson, and I'm in charge of the ALCE group. I understand this is going to be the offload area," she said. "It's the planned location," Colonel Lightfoot said. "Good. We'll get set up and we'll be ready to meet the next aircraft in 1 hour. Everything I need is on this aircraft, she indicated, as 3 pickup trucks rolled out along a heavy-lift forklift and 40 Air Force personnel. Then came 3 large 10-kilowatt generators and 3 large light sets. If you'll excuse me, I'll get my people organized and positioned to meet the next aircraft. And with that, she departed. Colonel Lightfoot, may I ask, are all your women this take charge? Colonel Abdulaziz asked. Turning to face the colonel, Colonel Lightfoot said, Sir, if they're in uniform, they probably are. For 45 minutes, Lightfoot and Colonel Abdulaziz watched the Air Force Major organize her people. Then the next aircraft came into view as it set up for the final approach and landing. Colonel Lightfoot looked at the colonel's face as he saw what was probably 320 soldiers begin the process of filing out of the aircraft. Moments later, a lieutenant colonel walked towards the 2 of them. The paratrooper rendered a quick salute, which Lightfoot promptly returned. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Fitzgerald, the battalion commander for the 1st of the 325th Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division. Are you the MEU commander? Asked the paratrooper, all businesslike. Lightfoot nodded as the 2 shook hands. I am, Colonel Lightfoot. A second later, an Air Force colonel joined them. I'm Colonel Gomez. I've got a team of air traffic controllers and airfield operations folks with me. Can I get some of your Marines to show my guys to the tower and then give us a quick update on the airport? We've got a very long gravy train of supplies inbound to this airfield, and we need to get things ready to roll ASAP. Do you know where Major Dickerson is? Yes, sir. That we can do, Colonel Lightfoot said. He whistled and caught the attention of one of his junior officers. He told the sergeant to take care of the Air Force personnel and get them set up with Major Dickerson. Colonel Abdulaziz stood there in awe as he saw how rapidly this civilian airport was transitioning to a major military airfield. He couldn't believe how large these monstrous aircraft were and how much equipment they could move. While the Air Force contingent headed off with one of his squad leaders, a slew of the paratroopers were lined up outside the plane, pissing on the tarmac. Colonel Fitzgerald caught Colonel Lightfoot looking at them. Don't ask, sir. Some pog back at the Pentagon thought it would be a wise idea for the soldiers to load up on water a couple of hours before we landed. Needless to say, these guys have been pissing non-stop since we flew over Egypt. Colonel Lightfoot laughed out loud before he could catch himself. The Saudi colonel laughed as well. Sorry about that. That just seems like something an Renf would say. If you'll follow me into the command post I've established, I'll get you and your officers up to speed on the facility and the location of the closest Iraqi unit. Before Colonel Lightfoot and Lieutenant Colonel Fitzgerald started to leave, Colonel Abdulaziz said, If you gentlemen will excuse me, I will see if I can find someone who has, how do you say, porta-potties, yes? I think we will need them. Lieutenant Colonel Fitzgerald nodded in approval. That sounds good, sir. Once we get inside, I'd like to discuss with you how best to use my men, Fitzgerald said. The third C-5 parked near the second aircraft as the first C-5 had already departed. When its nose opened up, it revealed 4 M551 Sheridan airborne assault vehicles inside. There were also a handful of 5-ton trucks fully loaded down with supplies the paratroopers would need. Lieutenant Colonel Fitzgerald looked at the number of soldiers getting off the planes and the equipment they'd brought with them one more time before heading inside the terminal. These guys came ready to wage war! Standing inside the command post, Colonel Lightfoot watched an additional C-5 aircraft as it opened up its clamshell noses. Inside the aircraft were tons of communications equipment, ranging from vans and antennas to generators and powerful mobile light kits. Then, a few K-loaders, specially designed for the purpose of loading and unloading cargo, rolled off along with a handful of forklifts. While the second and third C-5s had been dedicated to getting an initial group of soldiers and bare-bones equipment to the airport, the next 2 were filled with the initial Air Force equipment needed to make this a fully operational airfield. As each aircraft was fully unloaded, they quickly started heading back out to the runway and returned to Germany to pick up another load, making room for subsequent aircraft to land at Jeddah. Colonel Fitzgerald announced, "The next 2 C-5s will be offloading the remaining elements of my battalion and our equipment. Should we need to, we're ready to bring the fight to the Iraqis until an element from the 24th Mechanized Division arrives in the wee hours of the morning. They'll be arriving with 4 M1 tanks, 4 Bradleys, and a couple of APCs." That's good to hear. Colonel Abdulaziz was telling me the closest Iraqi unit looks to be around 400 or 500 kilometers away, so plenty of time to get our forces built up, Colonel Fitzgerald explained. Sticking a wad of tobacco dip in between his lower teeth and his lip, the paratrooper nodded in approval. "I think for the time being, I'm going to billet my battalion in the Haji terminal with your permission, sir. I suspect that will keep my boys away from the Air Force folks. Seems the Haji accommodations are unsat for the Air Force people," Fitzgerald pointed out, and Colonel Lightfoot agreed. Colonel Abdulaziz had returned from ordering up a load of porta-potties and asked, "Why are the Haji accommodations unsatisfactory for the Air Force? Pilgrims on the way to Mecca find them satisfactory." "Sir, us Army dogs would find them satisfactory too, as would the Marines. But since they only offer shade and sleeping on the concrete floor with no air conditioning and portable toilets, that wouldn't meet the Air Force standard of comfort," Lieutenant Colonel Fitzgerald explained. He pointed to a number of the Air Force members who were taking over the Saudi Airlines International Terminal. "They seem to have found the terminal the Royals use while they wait for their flights and claimed it for their people." The 3 officers laughed at the joke, though the Army and Marine officers knew it to be true. The chair force, as they were often called, tended to be the softer branch when it came to billeting. It was kind of an inter-service joke between them all. All night, C-5s, C-141s, and C-130s were landing one after another. They were bringing in a Patriot missile battery and its entire set of equipment, along with additional missile pods and missile reloads. A company team of 4 Bradley fighting vehicles, 3 M113 tracks, and 4 M1 Abrams tanks arrived as the 24th Infantry Division's Rapid Reaction Force. A battery of 105mm artillery arrived from the 82nd Airborne Division. In addition to the vehicles being offloaded, pallet after pallet of food, water, medical supplies, and munitions continued to arrive and steadily began to fill the nearby hangars. By dawn, an additional 600 soldiers had landed, bringing the total number of U.S. forces on the ground to nearly 1,300. Dawn, Jeddah Airfield. As the aircraft came to a stop and its nose began to open, the loadmaster started the process of loosening the chains on the 2 tanks the aircraft was transporting. The tank crews seated upstairs in the back of the C-5 started moving down the stairs to assist in getting their vehicles offloaded. What everyone noticed immediately was that when the nose of the aircraft began to open, the cool air from the plane's air conditioning was quickly replaced with an oppressive heat wave that felt like an oven. It was still dark, being only 04:20 in the morning. Almost wincing at the heat wave that washed over him, Captain Poggy was glad to finally link up with his first sergeant, 1SG Kenny Brown, and the infantry lieutenant for the 4 Bradley fighting vehicles, of which 3 had arrived on a previous aircraft, along with 2 of the M113s. The 4th Bradley was on this flight with Captain Poggy. 3 more C-5s would bring the rest of the tanks and company along with ammo and supplies. 1SG Brown usually rode in their M113. These vehicles were typically used for resupply and medical evacuation, in addition to transporting up to 11 infantrymen. Captain Poggy led the company, riding in his own tank. Normally he would have stayed back in Fort Stewart, pushing the rest of his company out the door. But this was a no-shit operation, and he wanted to be on the leading edge, leading from the front and not the rear. He had a competent executive officer and felt he could get the rest of the company deployed and link up with him over here. His tank was the first vehicle to exit. He was excited as hell to be standing in the commander's hatch when they began to move forward. As the tracks touched the ground, the driver accelerated and moved the tank around to the left, heading towards a large open area. The gunner traversed the turret, moving the 105mm gun from its rearward-facing position during transit to the front of the tank. "Renshaw," Captain Poggy called to his driver over the intercom system. "Yes, sir," the young private responded, excited. "Do you see where the Bradleys are parked in that open area? Pull us in next to them," Captain Poggy ordered. "Yes, sir," Renshaw replied, as he turned the tank in a smooth, unhurried fashion. As they came to a stop, one SG Brown climbed up on the tank. The assistant gunner then climbed out, saying good morning to Top before going about getting their antennas put together and working with the gunner on getting a few other items on the outside of the vehicle readied. "Morning, sir. Welcome to Saudi Arabia," Top said in a chipper voice. "Thanks, Top. Has anyone met you yet that speaks English?" Captain Poggy inquired. "Yes, sir. A Lieutenant Colonel Fitzgerald from the 82nd came by and told me to tell you that once we have everything sorted on our end, we're to get a move on and head over to the Haji terminal." "Great. Did he say where that was, or how we get there?" One SG Brown pointed. "Those shitty tent-looking things about a mile north. He gave me the GPS coordinates and I plugged them in." GPS was something new to the U.S. Army, having only been released to the General Forces less than 3 months earlier. Special Operation Forces had been using the system for some time, but its introduction to the rest of the force was a huge leap forward in capability. A lot of people still didn't know how to fully use the system, but the ones that did were getting everyone else up to speed and exalting its greatness. The receiver was the size of a cigar box, which wasn't a problem for tankers or mech infantry soldiers. For light infantry, who had to carry everything on their backs, it was added weight and a pain in the butt. Top added, "Captain, the colonel wants us dispersed before dawn. He's concerned the Iraqi Air Force may pay this place a visit." Captain Poggy grunted at the news. The last thing a tanker wanted to run up against was a ground attack fighter. Or, God forbid, a hind. "All right, Top, let's get a head count and sensitive items check and get moving." Once the remaining tanks arrived and were ready, their antennas set up, their radios loaded with their ComSec, and their targeting computers warmed up, the company team started moving out in the direction of the Haji tents to figure out where they wanted them to head next. Captain Poggy spotted a sergeant near the Haji terminal and stopped his tank near him. "Good morning, Sergeant," he announced loudly to be heard over the tank's engine. "Who's in charge here?" Captain Poggy told the driver to turn the tank off for the moment as he climbed down to talk with the paratrooper. The rest of his vehicles did the same. "Sir, I think the king is, but Lieutenant Colonel Fitzgerald could tell you better. I just called him, so he should be down shortly." "Sergeant, I just spent 18 fucking hours on a plane scrambling to get an armor company team all the way across the world. Cut the shit and try staying focused. We've got 2 corps of Iraqi Republican Guard units headed this direction. Got it?" Captain Poggy barked hotly. He didn't like the sergeant cracking jokes about the king being in charge. This was a U.S. military operation, and that meant there was a U.S. person in charge, not the King of Saudi Arabia. The paratrooper looked like he wanted to melt away into the background, but couldn't. He only nodded his head and went back to standing watch while they waited for Lieutenant Colonel Fitzgerald to arrive. "Wonder what got this captain's panties in a knot," the young sergeant was thinking. Sitting on the front of his tank with his feet dangling off the armor, Captain Poggy was amazed at the size of this place. The Jeddah airport was one of the largest airports in the kingdom. During the Hajj, it would service over 80,000 people coming and going to and from Mecca. In 1981, it had been officially opened as the kingdom's main international airport. Its formal name was King Abdulaziz International Airport, but the troops just called it Jeddah Airfield. Maybe 20 minutes later, a Humvee pulled up and an American officer stepped out. Captain Poggy recognized the rank and saluted the officer. "Sir, Captain Poggy, a company, 3rd of the 69th Armor, 24th Division. I was told to report to you." The colonel returned the salute, then said, "Captain, we've been expecting you and are glad to see you guys have made it with your tanks. How many men do you have?" "Sir, all told, I have 70 personnel," Poggy reported. "Okay, follow me, and I'll show you where to park for the time being and where your troops will be staying. You need to be aware that you're in Saudi Arabia, and there are some strict rules here that your soldiers must be briefed on. Their conduct must be no less than stellar," Fitzgerald explained. "Yes, sir. I've had a talk with all of them, and they understand." "Good. Now follow me." "Sir, this is my First Sergeant Brown." Poggy introduced his senior NCO. "How do you do, First Sergeant?" Fitzgerald said, extending his hand as First Sergeant Brown saluted and then accepted the handshake. "I'll get you hooked up with my Command Sergeant Major, and you two can work out the sleeping arrangements while I take the captain here and show him our area of responsibility." "Very good, sir. If you want, you two can get going, and I'll find the Command Sergeant Major. This is NCO business, and you two don't need to be involved," First Sergeant Brown said respectfully. Fitzgerald turned to Captain Poggy. "I like this guy already. Very good, First Sergeant. Command Sergeant Major White is probably in the Haji area getting some coffee going," Fitzgerald pointed out. The Haji Terminal was the world's largest cable-stayed, fabric-roofed structure. The white fabric roof reflected heat, thus providing tolerable conditions during the day. The complex contained facilities for sleep, bare floor, food preparation, and various support services. To a soldier or a Marine, it was better than sleeping out in the desert, which they all figured was coming soon enough. Lieutenant Colonel Fitzgerald and Captain Poggy climbed into Fitzgerald's vehicle and headed to the north side of the airport perimeter. On the northwest side was the main entrance into the airport. One major highway entered off the 271 highway interchange and 2 secondary roads. The 2 secondary roads entered through what was known as Pilgrim Gate, so those could be controlled relatively easily. The problem was going to the major highway. A traffic control point would have to be established, and it was decided to place it under the overpass. In the very north center was another road entrance that would require a control point. As the Saudi Aviation Investigation Bureau was there, they didn't think they could close this road off completely. Still, they'd ask the airport administrator and see what they could make happen. They needed to get the airport fully secured before they brought in more aircraft and equipment. There were also several other tertiary roads that entered the airport complex. Most terminated in what appeared to be vehicle storage areas enclosed in fencing. These would need to be closed off as well. In the northeast corner was a warehouse complex that probably couldn't be closed off. Fortunately, between the highway and the airport perimeter fence was a service road the track vehicles and the Humvees could easily move over. As they drove around, they discussed a plan for the defense of the north side of the airport. The sun was beginning to come up as they arrived back at the Haji terminal, and so was the heat. Most soldiers were asleep. Soldiers believed that you should never stand when you could sit, never sit when you could lie down, and never stay awake when you could sleep. Most were implementing that policy. When Captain Poggy returned to the terminal, Lieutenant Colonel Fitzgerald introduced him to his other company commanders and began to outline their assignments. "We have the mission to secure the northern perimeter of this airport. The rest of the division will be flowing into here, and I suspect a lot more than just our division will eventually make their way here. The Marines are going to secure the terminal, control tower, and administrative building. We have responsibility for the north and screening along the eastern side, halfway down. A company," he called, gaining the attention of the A Company commander. "You're responsible for maintaining the checkpoints at the northwest corner. That's the major highway off 271 and the checkpoints for the secondary roads. put your checkpoint for the major highway under the overpass. Saudi police will assist you in checking individuals at those checkpoints. You are there to back them up. Understood? Fitzgerald asked. Yes, sir. No questions. Bravo. You have the checkpoints at the Aviation Investigation Bureau entrance and the compound to the east of that area. Understood, sir. Charlie, you have from the Jeddah Northeast substation east to the TAL JV compound. Got it, sir. Delta, you have the TAL JV compound to the end of the eastern perimeter fence, which includes the aircraft accessories and component compound. Roger, sir. Captain Poggi, I'm keeping you in reserve. I want your vehicles where they can quickly move to cover the major entrance to the airport, as well as scan and conduct a screen along the eastern perimeter. Sir, I'll position 2 tanks with Company A and 2 in the vicinity of Delta, with my Bradleys acting as a roving patrol along that eastern perimeter, if that's good with you, Captain Poggi offered. Good. Now, the Command Sergeant Major will get with your first sergeants and work out setting up the checkpoints. This is NCO business, so stay out of it. Rotate your guard mounts as you see fit. I'll leave that up to you, but I would recommend we don't leave people out more than 4 hours, and make sure everyone has plenty of water when out there. Be sure everyone has overhead cover of some kind to keep the sun off them, Fitzgerald said. Looking over at Captain Poggi, he asked, How are the air conditioners in your vehicles working? Oh, sir, they're working great, he responded with sarcasm, dripping off every word. Armored vehicles had no air conditioners, and temperatures could easily reach 130 degrees in the tanks. Hatches were open whenever the vehicle was stopped, and not in combat conditions. All right then, let's get to it. And be safe, Fitzgerald said as he concluded the briefing. Another aircraft could be heard making its final approach. They were landing at a rate of 2 jets every hour, if not more frequently at this point.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.